Hello everyone! Today, literary review, so I put on my glasses to talk to you about this amazing book full of paradoxes, ideological biases, and fingerprints. So, it is co-written by two big names in economics, Klaus Schwab, already the founder of the World Economic Forum, but there's no need to be afraid, and Thierry Malray, the Associate Director of Monty Barometer, a concise predictive economic analysis service. That's quite something. And after a merger, we end up with a book of post-COVID economic predictions to anticipate the world of tomorrow. Even though, according to them, making forecasts is a fool's game, well, I hope they don't plan to drag us into their madness. Quite a contradiction for a book of predictions. And that sums it up well, because between banality and obviousness, the few times they were wrong, they took risks and missed the mark. For example, when they talk about oil, low-priced oil. If this continues, which is likely, it could encourage consumers and businesses to rely even more on high-carbon energy sources. At the time his book was published, oil prices were already rising. They also mentioned the poorest African countries, which likely won't recover from COVID for years. While the pandemic will inflict suffering on a global scale, it is very likely that the trend will only go in one direction. For the world's poorest and most fragile countries, from bad to worse, state fragility remains one of the most critical global challenges, especially in Africa. I don't always give every example, but we get the idea. In the end, the poorest countries in Africa were barely affected, and their post-COVID difficulties are the same as before COVID. Nothing changed where they were doing well. On the other hand, releasing the book 6 months after the start of the pandemic, meaning too early to avoid talking nonsense, but just in time to sell a bunch of copies. That was a smart financial move, and honestly, in the end, it might be the best play from the duo. Alright, let's get started. What is this book about? What's its goal? COVID-19. The Great Reset tries to identify and highlight the changes to come and to make a modest contribution by describing what their most desirable and sustainable form could look like. The goal of this book is to offer some coherent and theoretically reliable guidelines on the possible course of events and to do so as comprehensively as possible. For them, the coronavirus crisis should be used as an opportunity to try to change things. We are now at a crossroads. Only one path leads to a more inclusive, equitable, and respectful world for Mother Nature. The other will lead us into a world similar to the one we've just left behind, but worse and constantly filled with unpleasant surprises. It's a bit like the level of a beauty queen's wishes. Everyone would like to make the world a better place, but still what's written in this book is a better world, according to their standards, and those aren't everyone's standards. It's about making the world less divisive, less polluting, less destructive, more inclusive, more equitable, and fairer than the one we lived in during the pre-pandemic era. Be kind, not mean, that's not nice. Not taking action would mean letting our world become meaner, more divided, more dangerous, more selfish, and simply unbearable. For large segments of the world's population, doing nothing is not a viable option. What a great man then. That's all well and good. But how do we get there? When you read these sentences, you think it's going to be some kind of manual. But actually, no, there's nothing concrete. At least not on the fair and inclusive sides. But well, rather than talking about what it doesn't have, let's try to see what's in the paradox. First, the pandemic, the starting point, is the pandemic. It's the reason for our troubles, the reason this book exists. And a good excuse to act on a global level if we consider the percentage of the world's population affected. The coronavirus crisis is so far one of the least deadly pandemics the world has seen in the past 2,000 years. It does not pose an existential threat, nor is it a shock that will leave its mark on the world population for decades. Oh really, but if it's not a threat, why did we go to war? The pandemic is greatly worsening the pre-existing dangers that we have failed to address adequately for far too long. It will also accelerate the worrying trends that have been developing over a long period of time. They said the world was already in bad shape and the pandemic served as a wake-up call for those who hadn't noticed. Like we were on the edge of a cliff and then the pandemic came from behind and boom, just a little push forward and we tumbled down. But on the other hand, at no point was it a problem of managing the event. No, the governments did what they had to do and those who say otherwise are wrong. The most immediate and visible impact is that many governments will be called into question, with a lot of anger directed at policymakers and political figures whose responses to managing COVID seemed inappropriate or poorly prepared. As Henry Kissinger observed, the cohesion and prosperity of nations rest on the belief that their institutions can foresee disasters, contain their effects, and restore stability. When the COVID-19 pandemic is over, the institutions of many countries will appear to have failed, but only appear so. If we ever face a truly virulent epidemic, I have no doubt about it, and we would find ourselves with some perfectly tailored new restrictions on our freedom. But by continuing just the same, that is, without stopping its spread. Because we don't want to close the airspace and all that, we'd probably end up with 1 or 2 billion deaths, but with impeccable management. So, the real question is, whose fault is it? Why did this little pandemic hit us so hard? Paradox number 2, globalization. According to them, it's because of our excessive interconnections and interdependencies. However, in today's highly interconnected and interdependent world, the impact of the pandemic will go far beyond the already staggering statistics concerning just deaths, unemployment, and bankruptcies. And so, largely because of globalization, the above clearly shows that ecological progress and globalization are the main culprits behind greater interdependence. Globalization, interdependence, poor management of the pandemic. It's pointless to try to restore the status quo. Hyperglobalization has lost all its political and social capital, and it has become politically impossible to argue in its favor. So maybe deglobalize. You say to yourself, well, no, because that would be the end of the world. Come on. A hasty withdrawal from globalization would lead to trade and currency wars, damaging every country's economy, causing social havoc, and triggering ethnic or clan-based nationalism. So, what do? Establish a form of globalization that is much more inclusive and fair, making it sustainable both socially and environmentally, and the only viable way to manage this withdrawal. Okay, so we just keep going the same way, right? I think if we paint our capitalism green, it should be acceptable to the public. The problem is, the pandemic probably won't care at all about the change in appearance. Actually, they seem so obsessed with globalization like it's the holy grail, that this ideological bias keeps them from thinking clearly, even though we know it. To get back to Africa, for example, pandemics, well, they travel by plane, and if we really wanted to stop them, maybe that's what we should focus on. Hey, defeating a virus by isolating it. That might seem logical, but it's not even an option for super globalists like Schwab or Attali, for whom a country is just a hotel. Hey, you start to wonder if the goal of this book isn't actually to show how, thanks to COVID, they could give a little boost to globalization, which was starting to go downhill. Today's world is more interconnected than ever, but for more than a decade, the economic and political momentum that argued in favor of globalization and supported its development has faded. That's sad. The risks of financial globalization became increasingly evident following the major financial crisis that began in 2008. He reassures us by saying globalization has faced rough patches before. Anti-globalization was strong during the period before 1914 and up until 1918, but less so during the 1920s. But it picked up again in the 1930s following the Great Depression, and fortunately each time a good war gave globalization a new boost. And now, well, it works out. With COVID, we are at war against an invisible enemy. Maybe it doesn't work as well, huh? Maybe we need a real one. Well, but to think that's why we're going to Ukraine to fight the Russians. Hey, come on!
Paradoxe 3, gouvernance mondiale.
According to our two economists, the key to effectively fighting a pandemic is strong global governance. And Rabasheben keeps saying in the book that things went wrong because there was a failure of this global governance. On one hand, the chaotic end of multilateralism, the void in global governance, and the rise of various forms of nationalism make it harder to fight the epidemic. Recently, global institutions and international organizations have either been weakened, like the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization, or have been unable to cope with the task. It's good to acknowledge it. For them, everything is connected. The risk of an infectious disease will inevitably have a direct effect on the failure of global governance, social instability, unemployment, fiscal crises, and involuntary migration. What is he doing here? In summary, on a global level, virtue and mutual assistance were notably absent. However, they do admit that on a smaller scale, things went better. Under stressful conditions, our attachment to our loved ones grows stronger, along with a renewed sense of appreciation for everyone we love, family, and friends. Throughout the lockdown periods, remarkable examples of personal solidarity emerged. But just because it didn't work on a large scale and worked better on a small scale doesn't mean much. Believing the nation-state is preferable to global governance. Careful, but there's a darker side to all of this. This also triggers a rise in patriotic and nationalist feelings, with troubling religious and ethnic considerations coming into play as well. In fact, as you see their development, you realize that global governance is mainly useful for maintaining economic globalization. We don't really care much about the pandemic. This will only be possible through better global governance, which is the most natural and effective mitigating factor against protectionist tendencies. And that's non-negotiable. Nah. The trilemma suggests that the three concepts of economic globalization, political democracy, and the nation-state are mutually irreversible. If we follow the logic that only two of them can actually coexist, at some point choices will have to be made. Since no one in the world wants to sacrifice the appearance of democracy, the nation-state must disappear to allow economic globalization to flourish, which is why global governance is so important, erasing the nation-state. And those who are against it are either far left or far right. In this book, they would rather abandon logic than economic globalization. Even without pressure from the far right and environmental activists, many governments will realize that certain situations of commercial dependence are no longer politically acceptable. They're clever. How can the United States administration, for example, accept that 97% of the antibiotics supplied in the country come from China? They're in trouble because they want to fully globalize, but it's not working. Luckily, they have one last option. The most likely result of this globalization-no globalization continuum lies in an intermediate solution: regionalization. The success of the European Union. Success and European Union after, sorry, I can't do it. The success of the European Union as a free trade zone or the new regional comprehensive economic partnership in Asia are examples. Speaking about how regionalization could very well become a watered-down new version of globalization. When you can't do better, you do what you can. Right now, we're in the middle of it. The success of the European Union with energy, maybe global governance to manage global issues, a pandemic, ocean management, that would make some sense, but it's not at all incompatible with the nation state, with local management of local problems. Actually, for global governance, the best thing is a common enemy. The pandemic almost worked. If we ever don't accept global warming, I wonder what they'll come up with next, the supporters of global governance. But now, the beginnings of global governance like the European Union show us that there's a desire to control much more than that, and to let a harmful economic globalization thrive there, hence the rejection. Paradox 4. Green technology. In this book, we have two consecutive chapters, one on environmental reset and the other on technological reset. We save the planet by going all in on tech. To put it simply, major technological innovations are about to drive a major change worldwide, entering the era of all digital automation and home delivery of products by drone. And actually, it goes around the world thanks to Amazon, even though it was in the store right next to your house. Well, that's great for the planet. At the same time, large online companies like Amazon or Alibaba have made decisive advances in the field of zoo water. Especially in food distribution and logistics, it seems like flawless logic to them. The world will be greener, hyper-connected, and filled with robots. But on the other hand, in the book, they don't explain how new things that use energy will end up using less than if they didn't exist. That's where I get a little lost. Don't you? Wait, but he's not here. Him? Oh no, COVID topic, so maybe no monetization. And he didn't just work for nothing, but in the end, we don't really miss him that much. In the end, he's replaced by a robot, the automation of emptiness. Anyway, the only argument they give here for a technology that allows for less pollution is remote work. To avoid commuting and video conferencing, to avoid taking a plane. The same reasoning applies to many different fields, like flying to a meeting. Zoom is safer, cheaper, more environmentally friendly, and much more convenient. Finally, as he says in an interview, that's for others, for the really important people. It's still essential to meet in person, to shake hands after a little plane trip. Why not in Davos? Talking face to face changes everything. If we have that direct contact, we have the opportunity to express things in a slightly more personal way, to really say what we think. And that's the spirit of Davos. Given the strictness of the lockdowns, the figure of 8% seems rather disappointing. 8% is the drop in global carbon dioxide emissions in 2020 thanks to the lockdown. It seems to suggest that small individual actions, consuming much less, not using our cars, and not flying, don't matter much. compared to the scale of emissions generated by electricity, agriculture, and industry. Basically, most of the pollution ultimately escapes from the tailpipe of economic globalization. And for that, in this book, they don't have a proposal. Paradox 5, the United States versus China. Well, this one is just for fun, because I think it's my favorite part. At the moment when they talk about the potential future greatest world power, and in the same paragraph, they manage to contradict themselves. There is no right or wrong point of view, but different and often divergent interpretations which are often linked to the origin, culture, and personal history of those who put them forward. In this sense, a Chinese point of view and an American point of view can coexist, as well as many other points of view within this continuum, each one being real, and on that, I completely agree. Because it's true that we too often tend to think of history as a monolithic block, and above all, we don't respect the different points of view. But here you'll see, after a few sentences, the respect is gone. The Chinese view of the world and the country's place in it is influenced by the humiliation suffered during the First Opium War in 1840 and the invasion that followed in 1900. On the other hand, the way the United States sees the world and its place in it largely depends on the values and principles that have shaped American public life since the founding of the country. Well, yes, that's for sure. You absolutely have to be on the side of the United States with their well-known values and principles, and definitely not on the side of a revenge-seeking country like China. Hollywood has brainwashed him, or maybe it just suits him. Besides, that's not true. The Chinese, they don't care about the Opium War anymore, but they still hold a grudge against the Japanese. It's like if we still resented the Russians over Napoleon's defeat. Actually, we do resent the Russians. Because of Macron and Bruno Lumiere. Ah, Bruno Le Maire, would you like a little conclusion? Alright, we'll stop here. And if I had to sum up this book, I'd say COVID-19. An opportunity to wipe the slate clean for the world's looters and open the doors for them to a new heist. Oh yeah, so Great Trizé would be kind of like a formatting of memories. Yes! So that all those who made a lot of money off the backs of the people and their suffering, thanks to unbridled capitalism and excessive globalization, don't worry too much about it. Even though it became obvious to everyone because of COVID, today we're wiping the slate clean. But they can still keep the money. Obviously that's it, I'm leaving the past behind, so everyone I owed money to, just know that I won't pay, that's exactly it. COVID-19 gives everyone a second chance. They'll be able to do exactly the same thing, but better, more inclusive, more equitable, and more respectful of nature. Well, on paper, yes, I abused kids for 50 years, but that's in the past, so please don't judge me for my past, especially since today I do it much less. And twice a week I volunteer at a daycare, and unfortunately in the eyes of most people, that'll be acceptable. When you add the word green after the word capitalism, for many people it has nothing to do with it anymore, it's not the same thing. And now, with inclusive forced labor, fair deprivation of freedom, and nature-friendly pollution, I don't see what anyone could complain about. And the worst part is that since all the decision makers and billionaires agree with this concept, that's what's going to happen. But then there's no conspiracy. No, everything is out in the open. We have a clique that wants the most unrestrained economic globalization above all else. To make their business prosper and therefore to fight against their main enemy, the nation state, they want global governance. And to achieve that, the pandemic in the end is just a pretext. Okay, but if we still want conspiracies, maybe it's at the level of the common enemy as a pretext that it happens. No, I don't know. Future extraterrestrial pandemic, third world war? Yes, 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 in the end, I hope that if I have to choose, it will be global warming. I want to clarify that I only based myself on the book and not on what Schwab may have said or written, aside from that. Otherwise, indeed, there will be material to extrapolate as usual, thanks to those who order J. Thanks to those who share, those who watch until the end, those who like, and those who tip.